Good morning, beautiful morning, wonderful morning. So today, it seems like belief in God and wrestling with God is on our minds. So I think even an honest atheist, and I say atheist in quotations because perhaps at some point later on we can get to what is an honest atheist anyway. But I think an honest atheist would agree that at first cause, an original being must have preceded the universe. This is actually, or this idea of original cause was the source to what humbled Einstein. Now, he incorrectly described it as a religious experience. I'm not sure it was a religious experience, but he was humbled by this idea of an original cause. I think that when people think about faith, the questions of faith begin with how. How do we understand this first cause? How do we understand its nature? How do we understand its relationship with us? And I would say, even more importantly than its relationship with us, its relationship with the universe, with the world at large. If someone says, sorry, if someone says, I believe there's a God, okay, I'm happy for you. And I don't believe there's a God. And maybe there's a God. It's pretty meaningless. Faith, belief in God, is not the ability to imagine that which does not exist. I'm going to say that again. Faith is not the ability to imagine that which does not exist. Faith is finding relevance in that which is transcendent. To believe in God means that you're not of the opinion that God exists, but that you've found relevance with God. When a person says, I believe in God, I think what they're really saying is, God is significant in my life. I have found a significance in a higher power in my life. So when discussing our relationship with God, I think the first question I would ask, and I hope you'll entertain this with me, is who cares? Who cares? In what way is God relevant? In what way is God important or even matter? Some people say that God is relevant because they're concerned with the origins of existence. For others, God is relevant because they're concerned with an afterlife. They wonder what's going to happen after this world. And for some reason, somehow, faith in God seems to be a prerequisite for getting to heaven. And I think there's others who say God is relevant because they believe that life has a purpose. So whether you're concerned about the origins of existence or you're concerned with whatever's after this world, or you believe that life has a purpose, is it enough to say, I care and God is relevant? In Judaism, and I will say particularly in Kabbalah, the interest in God comes from the conviction that life has purpose, that life has meaning. The recurring question in Kabbalistic thought is, why is a soul sent into the world to suffer in a physical body for 80 or 90 or 100 years? Why the suffering? We know there's a purpose, and that God is the author of that purpose. And we want to know and understand it. So, Kabbalistic thought teaches that the mind is the soul's capacity to detect logic. The heart is the soul's capacity to respond negatively or positively. So the mind detects the soul's logic, and the heart is able to respond negatively or positively to what the mind detects. The respective functions of the mind, the heart, and the soul are often confused. So somebody who's very emotional, somebody who lives by their heart exclusively, is only going to trust what they feel. Someone who lives by their mind exclusively is only going to trust what fits, what their mind says is true. But neither of these alone tell the truth. The mind demands that logic be trusted. The heart demands that the emotions be trusted. Yet both can be mistaken. They each of them on their own are not able to reveal an inherent truth. So what do we have to do? For that, we have to turn to the soul, what we call in Hebrew the neshama, because the soul is part of the divine. The soul is part of God, and that is truth. When we have faith, when we find relevance in God, we're trusting that instinct in the soul that tells us that God is the purpose of life. You follow? So let's look at this in pragmatic terms. The mind, the heart, and the soul must each fulfill their function. When we know all that can be known, when we come to the edge of knowledge, and logic itself tells us that we've reached its outer limits and it can't handle what lies beyond this point, all of a sudden faith enters. Where the mind is no longer adequate, the soul responds to truth. This is faith. This is exactly what faith is. You see, a lot of the people who trust their minds, well, eventually their mind is going to say, this is not possible. The people who trust their hearts, well, at some point they're going to feel something with their intuition or something in their gut, and it's going to say this is wrong. But if we take each of them, and in Kabbalistic terms, we start off with the mind, because we as it says in the Hasidic teachings, moach shalit al halev, which means the mind must hone the heart. So often in our society, in the way that we've been raised, it's to trust the gut or to trust the heart. The heart is not always trustworthy. Another way that we've been raised is to trust the mind. But the mind is not always trustworthy because it's only as good as our understanding, as our education, and as our experience. So then what do? What we have to do is the mind needs to hone the heart. The mind needs to understand, and then the heart needs to respond with the emotion. Imagine me giving this class without heart. There's a lot of mind in this class, but mind without heart, well, you're probably all going to be sleeping by now, which I understand if you're already half asleep. And then there's a third component, the component of the soul. How does the soul work? The soul works, the soul response is necessary because there are three categories of mitzvot. A mitzvah, often translated as a good deed, actually comes from the Hebrew root word tzavta, which means connection. The purpose of a mitzvah is not necessarily a good deed, but rather to connect us with God. That's the purpose of it, to create a connection. So there are three different types of mitzvot. There are mitzvot that are called mishpatim. They're judicial commandments, which don't kill, don't steal, all those things that create society. Then there's mitzvot that are called edut, which are testimonial commandments. They're a testimony to God's existence. For example, Shabbat. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So Shabbat becomes a testimony to God's existence. And then there's a third category of mitzvot. Those mitzvot are called chukim, or a chok. Chukim, those laws, they're supra-rational laws. They're mitzvot that don't subscribe to reason. Now, I'll give you an example of it. Kosher. Keeping kosher is one of those laws. Now, you're probably going to say, what do you mean? Kosher's healthy. I've heard people say kosher's healthy. I can guarantee you that if you take nice white bread and cover it with mayo and mustard and chili sauce and salami, lots of salami, and all those things can very easily be kosher. Not all of them are healthy. Kosher it's one of those commandments that are super rational. We don't really understand it. And there's others. Now, if someone has difficulties with these particular mitzvot, with these particular commandments, that's an indication that they may be relying on the mind and heart at the expense of their own capacity to react to truth, at the expense of the expression of their soul. When we fulfill a mitzvah, before we've intellectualized it, what we're doing is allowing our neshama, allowing our soul to respond to truth. One of my favorite writers, he wrote mostly in Yiddish. He passed away in 1950. His name was Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. He was the sixth Rebbe of the Chabad Hasidic movement. And he wrote so many incredible stories. The recount of he was arrested in communist Russia for spreading Judaism, for being a religious figure. and his description of his experience there is vivid and incredible. He has a memoir, and he describes so many fascinating things in his memoirs. A lot of it is stories that his grandmother had told him, and often things that he experienced as a small child. And so he writes in his memoir that as a small child, he once asked his father, who was also a Rebbe, his name was Rabbi Shalom Dovber, and he was the fifth Chabad Rebbe, his father. He asked his father to explain to him why we follow a particular custom with regard to the prayer that we say upon waking up in the morning. So the prayer that we say right as we wake up, as we open our eyes, is a prayer of Modeh Ani. Modeh Ani lifanecha, melech chai v'kayam shechazarta bi nishmati v'chem l'raba emunatecha. Modeh Ani, I admit to you, lifanecha, before you, God, that you have restored my soul within me, returned my soul to me. My faith is great in you. And so he asked his father about this prayer. Now, instead of giving the child an answer, this is what he writes. Instead of his father giving him an answer, his father brought him to an elderly man, and he asked him, "Sir, why do you say the morning prayer this particular way?" So the man smiled and he says, "Rebbe, because that's how my father taught me to do it." Now, his father might have just as easily given him the rational reason for the custom, which there are rational reasons for everything, even things we don't understand. But instead, because maybe the child's mind wasn't formed, this is me, I'm just analyzing the story, because the child's mind didn't have the ability to understand reason, his father saw this as an opportunity to exercise his ability to respond with faith. And I think this story teaches us what is our approach to inviting one who even says they're an atheist or claims to not believe. For those of you who have been part of or exposed to various religious movements, often if you say to a religious person, "Oh, I'm an atheist," or someone says they're an atheist, it's usually a trigger to somebody who's religious. But to us, it's not a trigger, because if someone claims to not believe or to be an atheist, we will invite them to do a mitzvah even before we engage them in a discussion of faith. Because in consideration of the existence of the soul, we can assume that we don't have to convince people of life's divine purpose. We just have to get them started. And with each mitzvah they do, their neshama, their soul, asserts itself more, and questions become answered all by themselves. The best analogy I can give to this is a woman's maternal instinct appears to be absent. Now, if it's absent, you don't argue the philosophy of motherhood with her. You just put a baby in her lap, and a maternal response will emerge. Another story is of the late NASA scientist Velvel Green. He was at the University of Minnesota, and he was becoming a little more interested in Judaism, and he was a NASA scientist. So he sent the Rebbe a letter with all of his questions, of which he was grappling between science and faith. And he never received a response. And he was kind of shocked, but he continued in his journey, and he ended up becoming more faithful and more connected to Judaism, to the point where he actually became a religious Jew and moved to Israel. About 10 years later, he was sitting in a meeting with the Rebbe. He had already now been a believer, and he had already taken on various aspects of Judaism. And the Rebbe pulls out that letter from 10 years earlier and starts answering each and every one of his questions. And he turns to the Rebbe and he says, I don't understand. I sent this letter to you 10 years ago. These answers are brilliant. Why didn't you respond then? I would have been a believer right away if you'd responded like that. And it took me, 10 years to get to this point. So the Rebbe smiles and he says, as a rabbi, as a Rebbe, my job is not to answer questions, but to make friends. If I would have answered you then, I would have answered your questions, but I wouldn't have had a friend. Today I have a friend and I can answer your questions. So often we approach questions of faith and we say it needs an answer. Or someone debates you and you're like, how could you even believe this? Well, if we're not friends, there's no way that we can influence each other. You see, what a debater wants to do is influence someone of their opinion. You're not going to be able to change or influence an opinion if that person can't be vulnerable. The person won't be able to be vulnerable if you don't have a relationship. I think that had we had this class, if you asked me to give a class like this 2 or 3 years ago, when many of you had first started this journey, I don't know if I would have been so open to give it. But now that we have a relationship, now that we know each other, it's not that you know that my words are not pointed, they're not debating, they're not answering. It's a relationship. We understand each other, and as a result, we are both vulnerable with one another. You have asked me the question, and I am answering with the same vulnerability as you asking it. But that relationship allows us to transcend the conversation. It's a soul relationship, not one that's just connected to the mind and the heart. So today we can have this conversation. Today we can have a different type of conversation than we could have before we knew each other. And it's always the great question. Myself, as often a lot of people hear my statements and my classes without knowing me, sometimes they perhaps don't have the same relationship and don't have the same ability to be able to understand them and understand that I'm coming from a place of love and kindness and not a place of challenge. Yet, in order to be a teacher, we also have to challenge, but we're challenging from a place of love. Challenging mind, love, heart. Challenging first, love second. Soul beyond. So, talking about God, the relevance that we find in God is going to differ from person to person. That's just the reality. Being that God is everything, we will experience God in every possible way. It's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of benevolence and might. And it's also true, as God says, I am known according to my deeds. Some will say God is rewarding. Some will say this is the God who punishes, the God who provides, the God who saves, the God who enlightens, the God who inspires. It goes on and on and on. When God is everything, it could be everything or anything or nothing, because being everything also is nothing as well. Otherwise, you're limited to everything. Different conversation. So in the beginning, God revealed himself as, and I say he, not in the, and we can talk, we've spoken about this before. It's not gender specific. It's just because of our relationship, the nature of our relationship with God. So God revealed himself as the creator, as the master, as the king. They're all very impersonal roles. In the Torah law, in Jewish law, God reveals laws, but doesn't allow personal feelings to show. And then when we study Kabbalah, God makes himself vulnerable. God shares intimate details, almost for the sake of metaphor, humanized in a two-way relationship. So the master of Jewish law has a great respect for the wisdom of the commandments. But the mystic is going to see God as taking the mitzvah personally. When God says, don't cut down fruit trees, if we were sensitive, we wouldn't only hear the commandment, but we'd see something about God. Kabbalah reveals that something. Jewish law, the halacha, those are the details. But Kabbalah reads between the lines. Kabbalah gives us a very different perspective on God's, I don't know, this is a word that's only used in reference to God, but in English, God's anthropomorphic, and I say that in quotations. God's anthropomorphic behavior. It reminds us that the Torah comes to teach us about God, and that expressions such as God spoke or God's hand or God's anger need to be considered from God's perspective, not from our perspective. We're not the reference points for God's behavior. God should serve as a reference point for our behavior. God created the world, speech, hand, anger, jealousy. These are all God's creations. These are all divine rights. Our speech, our hands, our anger, our jealousy, these are only metaphors for the real thing, not the other way around. It's not God, we are a metaphor for God, not God a metaphor for us. When we read that God raises his hand and splits the sea, we need to measure our own hand against that. When we raise it, what happens? Nothing. We learn that we're not quite as powerful as God. We can't raise our hand and split the sea. When we read that God gets angry and punishes because God created a world with divine purpose, and that purpose is frustrated, we have to measure our own anger against that. What have we created? Nothing. So we can't get angry and punish like God does because we never created anything. Considering God's anger and considering other attributes in this way, I think will bring us to a humbling recognition that only When our anger or our jealousy is an expression of moral indignation, does it reflect the true divine qualities? Only then can we exercise such expressions. Whatever truth there is in anything in us, it's to the extent to which we embody what it is that God tells us about ourselves. Anything. Marriage, the idea of marriage, one of the reasons why it's only a faith-based or religious act is because it is supposed to mimic our relationship with God. Only through marriage can we understand God, our relationship with God, because at Sinai, 3,300 and some odd years ago, at Sinai, we married God. And in that relationship, God became our husband and we became the wife. And in that relationship, we see God as the protector, as the helper, in the way that the traditional male in a relationship is seen. That's why we call God he, because God's our husband. Now, there are other faiths that call God she. For example, Allah is a she. And so in that traditional role, that faith would have to protect God. You see the difference? The difference is that if you see God as your protector, as you see God as above you in that role, then you can experience faith very differently. If you need to protect God, well, then you're going to have to go to war. If somebody makes a comic that defames your God, you're going to have to go to war because you're the protector of God. So we exist as a metaphor. So instead of trying to start from below and trying to find God above, start from above and find yourself below. Instead of saying, oh, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know what's going on. I better live my life with meaning in this crazy world that's becoming crazier and crazier by the day. Say, no. Before I was created, God had a reason for creating me. And it's my job to find the purpose for which God created me. You see the difference? See yourself as the metaphor, not God as the metaphor. And then you'll find faith in a very different way.